Are you a CEO looking to scale your company faster and easier? Check out Thrive Roundtable. Thrive combines a moderated peer group mastermind, expert one-on-one coaching, access to proven growth tools, and a 24/7 support community. Created by Inc. award-winning CEO and certified scaling-up business coach Bruce Eckfeldt, Thrive will help you grow your business more quickly and with less drama. For details on the program, visit eckfeldt.com/thrive. That's eckfeldt.com/thrive.
Hey everyone, Bruce Eckfeldt here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications so we can let you know when the next video is posted. You can also check us out at eckfeldt.com for more great content. With that, let's go check out the video.
You're listening to Thinking Outside the Bud, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, thought leaders, researchers, advocates, and policymakers who are finding new and exciting ways for cannabis to positively impact business, society, and culture. And now, here is your host, business coach, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thinking Outside the Bud. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. Today, I'm here with Mark DeRosa. Mark is CEO and founder of Vantage Point Benefit Administrators. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the HR, the employee-employer relationship side of this whole business. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bruce.
So why don't we start? I always like to have guests kind of start a little bit about your background. Tell us about the business. Like, how did you get into the space, and professionally, what have you been doing before this?
So I've been in the employee benefit arena working with employers for almost 30 years now. And over the years, what's happened is with the increase in government regulations and compliance requirements, our business and our expertise has really morphed from not only doing employee benefits, but moving into the world of HR administration, working with companies to help develop HR best practices and compliance enforcement.
Yeah. And so, if you look at this, I mean, I think one of the things in the cannabis world that we talk a lot about is kind of the legality and the whole issue of, state versus federal and things like that. And people talk about the finances. People talk about kind of the risk to the business from, kind of plant touching and not plant touching kind of business. But I think one of the things that gets overlooked is this whole issue of whether you're in the cannabis business or you're not in the cannabis business, how do you respond to this from kind of an employee policy, employee engagement point of view for these states that have cannabis legal, state laws? So whether it's medical or recreational, I now have people who are taking cannabis. And I think that causes a lot of kind of issues, questions, uncertainty. So from a sort of an HR, benefits, policy, sort of legality point of view, I think it'd be interesting to talk about that. And we can kind of start wherever you think it's best to start. But, I'm curious what your kind of view is on the cannabis side as an advisor, as someone who helps companies figure out these policies, helps figure out how to engage and manage employees in different ways. How do you see this playing out?
Well, one of the interesting things that employers have to worry about now is it's not just at the federal level and it's not uniform across the country. So employers, certainly employers that are in multiple states, have many more issues to deal with when it comes to this. And then with cannabis, there's actually two different categories of it. There are the states that have passed cannabis use for recreational use, and then there are states for medical use. Okay. And that in and of itself creates more problems for an employer of how to define that.
Yeah.
And what most employers are looking at is they're going back a little bit back in time and looking at when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. Okay. And that applies to every company that has more than 15 employees. So this really affects a lot. And in that world,
that's federally. This is across the United States.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's a federal law. Any employer that has more than 15 employees has to provide what is defined as reasonable accommodation if there is a defined disability under that law. So when that law was first passed, what's happened in the past happens in the future. Yeah. We're seeing the formation of that under cannabis. What I mean by that is
so let's go back and talk about the policy, because what did that actually do in terms of business?
Right. So what that law did is the federal government came up with a list of what they deemed a disability. Okay. And then they went to the employer and said, you can't hire or fire based on these disabilities.
This is protected class? I mean, this
these
is
what exactly.
Okay, that's what
protected classes.
Right.
And beyond that, if a person comes to you and has those types of disabilities, you also, as the employer, have to provide reasonable accommodation. So I'll give you an example. So let's say there is somebody that has debilitating disease that's related to muscle, and them sitting in a chair they can't sit in a chair at a desk job for 8 hours a day. So there might be ergonomic chairs that might be more accommodating for that person. A standing desk might be more accommodating for that person. So those are very small examples of where an employer, quite honestly, is incurring an additional expense to provide the accommodation for that employee that falls under that disabled category.
You would define that person in that situation as a protected class?
Correct.
So now what that means, just to make sure I get this right, so from an employer point of view, it means that I cannot use that as a decision maker or a part of my decision making process to hire them or not hire them, or to fire them and not fire them.
Correct. Unless it's a direct correlation to being unable to perform the material functions of the position.
Okay. All right. So and now so this is one example.
Right.
What are some of the other kind of cases that come up, or things that, typically come up, or maybe even the things that employers don't think about that fall into this category of protected class and things that you cannot hire or fire based on?
So one of the biggest ones, and I'll use this because I think it ties into cannabis where we're going, is alcohol. So alcoholism is a protected disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that does not mean that an employee is allowed to come to work drunk every day.
Yeah.
Okay. But we all know how society and employers will look at somebody who is willingly says, I'm an alcoholic. There will always be that fear of, well, are they going to come to work drunk? Are they going to be able to perform their functions?
Because I think this is the crux, or this is the key to this discussion. So if I have a series of candidates and I'm doing my research and I'm on their LinkedIn profile or something, and I see that they are, members of AA or somehow connected to AA, or somehow I learn that they are have identified as an alcoholic or associated with alcoholism in some way, that I cannot use that as discriminatory test or a discriminatory issue, or I can't use it in my decision-making process about whether or not I'm going to hire them.
That's exactly right.
And if they are an employee and I learn through some process that they, are seeking treatment for alcoholism, that I cannot use that to make a decision to fire them. So good. So I think that's level one. Is I'm not sure how many people know that. And I think, people that are in business or dealing with employees, may not appreciate that in and of itself. But I think that's a good explanation of why this is really an important issue for people and just in business in general. But it leads up, I think, to this whole kind of question of cannabis, because I think, so let's talk about it, because I think that there's kind of two different angles. Clearly, the alcoholism. So would you say that alcoholism is defined medical condition?
Is a defined medical disability.
Defined medical disability, and that's that's by this act by the federal government does that, defines alcoholism as a disability. Correct. So now the question is we haven't addiction to cannabis is not a defined medical disability as far as I know, but it sort of cues this thing up of saying, hey, if someone is taking cannabis for medical purposes, receives, and it gets very complicated, but at a state level receives basically a letter from the doctor saying that cannabis might help your condition. They take it to a dispensary. They get under state medical use laws, are able to obtain cannabis and use it in whatever form they're using it. You should now have this kind of quasi-medical application of cannabis in many states. And then you have the recreational side. So let's talk about how, from an employer point of view, what are the questions that start to come up, or what do employers start to think about? Because yes, you can't come to work high.
Can't come to work high.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk about that one, because I think that's maybe the first thing is. So I guess that makes kind of common sense, or we can kind of say that. But what does that actually mean? What does an employer need to do, or how do they need to kind of make sure that everyone knows you can't come to work high?
Right. So every employer still has a legal responsibility to provide for a safe and a productive work environment. So that's the overriding theme. So it all comes down to the performance. So you're exactly right. An employee can't take cannabis during work. They can't have cannabis-infused food at lunchtime and come back to work after lunchtime, okay? So there's that line that has. Now, but the other issue is, let's say you're at an interview, and I'm the prospective employee, and I volunteer to say, and the term that we're seeing in the courts is, I'm a card holder, right? Because if medicinal use, you will actually get a physical ID card.
Yeah, a state-issued card that says you are now authorized by the state to consume cannabis for medical purposes.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's the term, and that's what, when we see it in some of the court cases that we're seeing right now, that's where one of the issues are, because now if an employee brings that up, now there are various other state laws that they may be protected under. Quite honestly, a lot of employers aren't familiar with these laws.
Yeah.
So,
and this is all state, right? Because now, cannabis is still federally legal. So that the federal laws are not coming into play on this one. It's the state laws that now potentially kick in for employers.
Right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And then there's, if I can, then there's the conflict. The other thing that a company needs to do is, well, if we already have a drug testing policy in place, marijuana under the federal law is still considered an illegal substance. It's a drug. So now what do we do when it comes to our drug testing?
Yeah. So, okay. So this is another. Is there a distinction between a company that only operates in one state versus multi-state, or?
Yeah, because drug testing is controlled at the state level. And virtually every state has slightly different rules and regulations related to drug testing, what an employer is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do.
Okay, so where do we start on this? Because I think that as an employer, I certainly would be very confused right now. I would be, okay, so I've got offices in multiple states. I've got a general policy that says we have a drug testing policy, and positive tests to marijuana use is a grounds for dismissal under our policy. Now I've got a situation where I've got some offices in states where they have medical and or recreational use. How does this affect me? How does this affect this policy?
So the key from an employer's perspective is, one, to know the states that where it's allowed on a recreational basis and states that allowed on a medical basis. Okay, that's step number one. Step number two is you have to have a written policy. Employers have to have a solid handbook that specifically talks about drug testing and how they view alcohol as an example, and now cannabis as an example in those handbooks. Okay.
So do I need to put in my handbook a specific section on cannabis separate from alcohol or separate from drugs in general?
Our recommendation is absolutely yes. Okay. And the typical model is using alcohol and the abuse of alcohol in the work environment is generally a very good foundation to start from, especially if you're not going to outside legal counsel or outside HR expertise, somebody like a firm like ours to do this. They want to do this themselves internally. Start with that language and then work from there. But again, they have to be aware of what's going on in the specific state, because the state laws have to do with where does the employee live?
Well, where does the employee live?
Correct.
Meaning what? So if I have an office that's right on the border of a state?
If I'm a company in California and I have an office in New York,
Oh, I see.
Well, right, for the employee that lives in New York, there's the California requirements. And then me as a New York resident, I might have other rights giving me access to cannabis than out in California.
Wow. So you really need to create the policy, even if your business is in one state, and say that state has no cannabis. Say you're in, I think it's Idaho right now, is the only state that has absolutely no access to cannabis in any way whatsoever. So if my office is in Idaho, but someone is across the border, they as an individual may have rights or may have access to cannabis under that state law.
Correct. And again, from an employer's perspective, best practice on that is then you identify that in your handbook. You have different sections in the handbook related to the states where you know that you have employees.
So for employees in such and such state that work for us, here are the guidelines and here is the policy, because we know we have this. Okay.
And the same thing when it comes to when that employer is doing interviews and they're looking to interview in those particular states to abide by what the drug testing rules are and so forth in those particular states.
Okay. But let me just make sure I understand. So as an employer, I can say you can't come to work under the effect of cannabis, which means, you can't use it before you come to work. You can't use it over lunch. You can't use it during work hours. I can do that. Like, there's no rights of the employee to be able to use that product during that time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So even if I have a medical license, even if I'm medically authorized to use cannabis for a legally authorized condition, as an employer, I can still say, look, we get that. That's cool on your own time, but you can't come to work high.
You cannot be impaired at work.
Okay, you cannot be impaired at work. So I guess my follow-up question to that is, for alcohol, we've got breathalyzers. It's alcohol has a certain kind of time frame in your system. I guess it feels like we've gotten to the point where we can kind of tell if someone is drunk or not, and it's reasonably deterministic. We don't have that in cannabis, right? Like the effects.
Right.
Yeah. So the effects, the length of the effects, how long it lasts, and the testing. I mean, the testing is, it's a fat soluble molecule that sticks around for 30 plus days. How do I know if someone's showing up at work high?
That's where we see is going to be the biggest open-ended liability from an employer, because you're exactly right. There currently is no test available that can determine current impairment, and that's the key. It's the current impairment. So to your point, a breathalyzer, blood alcohol content, we can tell you're currently impaired at the moment. Yeah. There is no current test for cannabis to do so. So that's where an employer is very concerned and should be very concerned, because now it's a he said, she said, it's a judgment call on that. So again, best practices, and it's all about documentation, creating the KPIs, creating the benchmarks, and as much measurable components that you can do if you're concerned of that potentially happening for employees that work for you.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like from an employer point of view, I've got kind of big categories or big kind of lines that I start drawing. It's like, okay, well, if someone is, working in the accounting department and they're, sending out bills and things like that, it's like, okay, yeah, like I don't want you high, right? Like I need to know that you're going to perform your job well. If someone is driving a 20-ton truck around making deliveries, that's a very different kind of risk liability, concern that I have associated in their impairment. Do you recommend, or do you have, situations where you may take a different approach, or you may have a different sort of approach to how you define the policy and how you define some of the things around how we determine if you're impaired, or the level of threshold or the level of test that we're going to put you through?
Well, we also be careful with that also, because you can't identify a class and treat that class of employee differently, especially if it's under an assumption. So you have to be very careful with that. So again, it comes back to, what is the company-wide policy going to be with regard to that? So in many respects, employers probably have to up their game a little bit when it comes to employee performance and tracking, and conduct of performance is really what an employer's threshold has to be, and it probably has to be higher than it currently is.
Yeah. So really what it's saying is that you need to think through what are your standards and what are your evaluation techniques and kind of the bars and the thresholds that you're setting company-wide across the board, regardless of just sort of the cannabis issue, if you want to be able to have a system that is effective in measuring performance, measuring people's ability to perform their job functions, and being able to filter out situations that may be indicative of use in some way.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So, it all comes back to, again, and it's all about setting that tone and that approach right from the beginning, even in the interview process, with regard to establishing when we are not doing a drug test.
Talk to me. I guess I don't know that much about the whole drug test process. I mean, if you're a company that is deciding, I guess at one level, how do you decide as a company if you're going to have a drug test policy? Because I'm assuming you can have a policy that says you can't be under the influence, but we're not going to have a drug testing system. Or we can say, no, we actually have a drug testing system. How does a company actually make that decision? And then if they decide they're going to have a drug testing system or policy process, how does that work? How do you actually set that up?
So generally, from an employer perspective, an industry perspective, any type of position or a company that's in a position where there's safety and risk involved, trucking, chemicals, anything those, typically those entire industries will have across the board mandatory drug testing. And then the key with that is, what's the language when they talk about drug testing? Are they going to say, we're going to do a drug test, and if anything comes up, that precludes us from hiring you? So you might pass everything else, but if we have a uniform drug test that says you cannot be hired if you fail any of these exams, that's a policy. And there are other companies that'll say that the drug test results are still contingent on your hiring. So now that's it almost sounds the same, but it is enough difference.
And what is the practical difference between those two statements?
So because the other one is, it's mandatory. You fail, you can't get the job.
Oh, even if we like you and we would want to hire you,
right? You meet all the skills. You meet all the skills. We like you. You have everything that we want. But sorry, you failed this test. We cannot hire you because our policy doesn't allow us to hire you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And the scenario number two is, well, the job is still contingent on the drug test. And let's see how the drug test comes back. And let's see what the severity of the drug that's in it, right?
Okay. So that basically I would go through the entire interview process that would say, hey, this looks great. Part of our interview process and policy is that you have to take a drug test before we do a final offer. You would take the drug test. I would get the results. And, if it shows that you're a regular user of crack cocaine, I could say, you know what, that's not a good fit for us, versus if I saw, a low level, marijuana use in the last 30 days, I could say, okay, look, we're assuming that this is not going to be a problem for the job. We're willing to give it to you, understanding the fact that you understand our policy and that you can't come to work high.
That's exactly right. And there was actually a court case similar to that in Rhode Island related just to that issue.
Meaning which way? That someone was making the hire or was refused?
Somebody was told that a drug test, that the job was contingent on a drug test, and that at that point they volunteered to say that I am a card holder.
Yeah.
And they said during the interview process that we promised not to ingest cannabis in any form during the workday. Yeah. And the employer decided not to hire the person.
And the person was this was a case that went to court where the person was saying, well, they weren't following their policy.
They were not following that policy. So the judge came down against the employer and said they were not following. And there were also two laws in the state of Rhode Island that was recited by the judge in the decision. But it really hung on the fact that, one, it was medically related, so it was protected under a Rhode Island law with regard to being medical. And the second one was the company was not consistent in the enforcement of their drug policy, the drug testing policy.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing it comes up in a lot of places, but certainly in this one is have a policy, make sure it's written, make sure people get it, that they're signing off for it, things like that. It has to be, a written policy that is in place, beforehand, and then two, applying that policy consistently across the board. And I think it sounds like if you don't have either one of those, like you don't have a policy, it's not written, people don't have it, or you're not applying it consistently from case to case to case, that is where you face risk.
Right. And here's the third thing that's a little bit unique to cannabis, unlike other things in the past, is proactive education.
Okay, so tell me about that. Like, what would you do?
So employers should, we all know the trend that's happening in this country with regard to cannabis. It's a national conversation. And whatever the projected use of it currently is, it's there. So it's important for employers to not hide behind the legality, hide behind a handbook, hide behind a policy. It's one of those things, again, especially with all the states promoting it from a medicinal perspective, that I think it's very important for an employer to do some education for the employees. And the education could take on a series of forms. It could be during an orientation webinar. It could be during an annual review of company policies and procedures. It could be in any form, but I think it's important that an employer does bring that up, because quite honestly, an employee is probably just as confused with what's going on, because they're still hearing, well, it's illegal. If it's legal on the federal side, how can the state that I live in allow me to smoke? And then all of a sudden I cross the border and now I can do it recreationally out in the street. But in this situation, because I crossed the state border, I can't. So I think there's a lot of confusion on both sides. And whenever I see confusion, best practice is let the employer take the lead. Yeah. Let's do this on a proactive basis, because more often than not, employees look to their employer for probably a lot of things that employers don't realize across all facets of benefits. And at the end of the day, cannabis and it's another policy. It's going to end up in some form or another. It's another employee benefit. It's about a rule, it's a process, it's a policy that we have in place, and it's related to the well-being of that employee. And a good employer should always be focusing on the entire holistic well-being of their employees. Yeah. And that involves some additional education when it comes to this morphing, brand new policy use throughout the country. I think it's a great best practice.
Well, and certainly, I mean, given that it is sort of flexing and changing so much, I mean, employees may not even know kind of what the state of things is. As an employer, it seems like a great way to kind of enhance the whole relationship with your employees, as being kind of, an open, honest, relationship that you're having in terms of, look, these are our expectations. This is what is out there. This is expected behavior. This is okay and this is not, and let's, if there's a problem with that, better have that conversation up front before you have an incident than trying to deal with it after the fact. So the kind of the ostrich strategy is probably not a good one here.
That's exactly right. And then as much as that's from an altruistic perspective, it also helps the employer from a legal perspective. Yeah. So when the courts see that there was proactive activity happening prior to the actual event, it can only help the employer.
So let's go back to the beginning on this. So we talked about this whole 15 employers or more. So, but this applies to anybody. I mean, anybody that has employees can do this. There's this 15 person number as being kind of, when the federal law stuff kicks in. That really is, it isn't that if I have 15 employees or more, I need to deal with this. I need to deal with this across the board.
If you have one employee, you have to deal with this because cannabis is not a protected disability at this point in time under that law.
As a kind of thought experiment here, say we go federally legal, say that, cannabis kind of gets rolled into this. What are the impacts then? Like what would then happen from a cannabis use point of view across the country?
Well, the unknown is from an employer's perspective. So one of the biggest things in ADA now is that reasonable accommodation that an employer has to provide. Well, what would be the reasonable accommodation for a cannabis user?
Yeah.
Nobody knows. So we don't know where that's going to go. Certainly, if it ends up being a protected disability in some form, then employers like consistency and like to know what the facts are, right? We're in an environment right now where we don't know where this is going. And an uncertainty creates issues. And uncertainty, quite honestly, creates more potential lawsuits. So if you agree with it or not, if it becomes part of the list of items that are allowed to be defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act, then at least an employer can know more consistently what they need to do.
Yeah. It actually, it's kind of the uncertainty is really the problem here. It's not so much whether it's right or wrong or whether, what you need to do. It's just knowing what it is. Then I can deal with it. I mean, it's like a, business point of view. I don't mind taking risks as long as I know what they are and I can manage them.
Right.
I mean, be kind of quick summary for folks, because I think we've covered a lot. But if you're an employer in general, and if you have employees, regardless of what state you're in, you probably need to be thinking about how cannabis is playing into your policies and your handbooks. So it sounds like, one, making sure that you have written policies in place that are distributed and people know about. Two, that you're actually applying those policies in a consistent, effective manner.
Right.
And then three, I think, was a really good point you made, which is get ahead of this conversation. So have this as a part of your conversation with your employees when you're reviewing benefits, when you're talking about updates to policies and procedures, whether it's individual annual reviews or overall company reviews, the hiring process, onboarding process, making sure that you're covering these things. Those three things will help you dramatically in terms of getting ahead of this whole game and minimizing your risk. And most importantly, I think just minimizing the potential drama that can come up in employee situations, regardless of going to court, just having, conflict with employees and having this uncertainty with employees, that's a problem in and of itself.
Exactly right.
Good. So, Mark, this has been great. If people want to find out more about you, about your company, have detailed questions about cannabis and HR policies and benefits, what's the best way to get a hold of you and find out more information?
So you can call us on a direct line. It's 516-599-2120. And even though I'm the CEO, I'll give you my direct extension. It's extension 295, or you can certainly review our website, vantagepointbenefit.com.
Excellent. I'll make sure that those are in the show notes so people have those. And you're working nationally with companies of all different sizes on benefits and plans and policies and handbooks and things like that. So
that's correct.
You can be a resource to just about anyone out there. Thanks so much for taking the time. This has really been a fascinating conversation, and I love the fact that this is everyone. This is people not just in the cannabis space, but this is anyone who has a business with employees. This is really helpful.
Great. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Thinking Outside the Bud with business coach Bruce Eckfeldt. To find a full list of podcast episodes, download the tools and worksheets, and access other great content, visit the website at thinkingoutsidethebud.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter at thinkingoutsidethebud.com/newsletter.